Okay, this video is going to focus on what we call the amplitude of a graph. So if you would turn to page 2 in your packet, you'll see this up at the top of the page. And this is the only thing this video is going to deal with. The rest of page 2 is on another video. So amplitude talks about the height from a midline. And then you can see we have this formula here. The maximum minus the minimum divided by 2. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about amplitude. So if we look at this sine graph, and we discussed this in the last video, right? A sine curve starts at 0, ends at 0, and in the middle passes through the x-axis again. But in between the first and the second 0, it goes up to its maximum, thus maximum. And in between the second and the third 0, it goes down to its minimum, thus minimum here as well. Okay, so if for this particular graph here, the y equals sine theta, if I were using the amplitude formula, right, amplitude would be equal to the maximum. Now let's look at the maximum. Here's my maximum, and that's a height of 1. So then my maximum would be 1 minus, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for my minimum, right? So my minimum is right here, and that minimum value is -1. All right, so -1 over 2. So then my amplitude would be 1 minus -1, which is 2, over 2. So my amplitude would be 1. Okay, now there's another way of looking at amplitude that I think sometimes is pretty easy. It says here, a number in front of sine or cosine changes the amplitude of the graph. So for example, let's look at this equation right here. There should be a number right in front of that word sine. And remember, if there's no number there, we can always assume it's a 1, right? That number right there signifies what we call the amplitude. And look, our amplitude is 1. So then we can kind of cheat and go over here, and we also understand that for a sine or a cosine curve, the number in front here, if there isn't a number, we always assume that's a 1. So then that means then that the amplitude would be 1. Okay, now we can do the same formula here if we want to, and we can say, okay, amplitude equals my maximum. So remember, my maximum is my highest value, which is 1, my lowest value, which is -1. So very similar to the graph that we just did over here on the left with the sine curve, 1 minus -1 divided by 2. I'm going to just kind of skip because I'm rewriting history here. And that amplitude then would be 1 as well. Okay? All right, now, another way we can also look at amplitude is this definition here. It says height from the midline. If we look at this sine curve right here, my midline would be the x-axis right here. Okay, or where my zeros are occurring. So 1, 2, 3 zeros, they're all occurring on the x-axis. So my height from my midline here is a distance of 1. It's also, if I were to look over here, this is also a distance of 1. It is in the negative direction, but it's still a distance of 1. So that's another way to look at the amplitude. And I'll talk more about that when we get to page 3. Okay, and then let's also look here at the cosine curve. Here's my midline again, okay, because that's where my zeros are occurring. And the distance from this midline up to its maximum value is a 1, or from the midline to its minimum value is a 1. So that's how I know that the amplitudes are 1. All right, I'd like you to turn to page 3 in your packet. All right, so let's look at the top of page 3. You'll see that you see this up here. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. So if we have a number in front of the word sine or in front of the word cosine, that is going to signify our amplitude. 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 Okay, so that A value stands for amplitude. And again, we can use the formula max minus min divided by 2. So if we look at this equation right here, we can see that my amplitude is 2, not 1. So instead of going up to a height of 1, we're going to go up to a height of 2. So a maximum of 2 and a minimum of 2. All right, so let's go back to what this is a sine curve. So let's go back to what the regular normal behavior of a sine curve is, right? So remember, it starts at 0, it ends at 0, and in the middle, it goes to 0. Okay, then a normal sine curve, in between the first two zeros, right, so here at pi over 2, it should go up to its maximum. Well, its maximum is going to be at 2 now, because that's the amplitude. So I'm going to put a dot right there at 2. Okay, and then we're going to look between the second and the third zero. And between the second and the third zero, the sine curve's behavior is to go down to its minimum. Well, we have an amplitude of 2. Now remember, if I'm going from the midline, which is my x-axis here, an amplitude of 2, it can go in the positive or the negative direction. And since I have to be going down to its minimum, I'm going to be going down to -2, which should be right here. Okay, so you're putting this into your packet as well. You're taking these notes. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to connect those dots. And there's my y equals 2 sine x. Okay, so again, now let's just double check. Maximum is 2, minimum is 2. And not that I need to do this, but remember, if I want to find my amplitude, right, I can do my maximum, and I won't do this for every single one, but I will just show you for this one, minus the minimum divided by 2. My maximum is 2, my minimum is -2, and I'm dividing by 2. So in the numerator there, I'm going to get 4 over 2, which is 2, and there's my amplitude. Okay, which matches that 2 in front of the word sine. All right, so let's move to the right and go to the y equals 1/2 cosine x. I think you can pretty much surmise that my amplitude is going to be a half this time. So we're going to follow the normal behavior of a cosine curve, but its amplitude or its maximum will be positive half and its minimum will be -1/2. Okay, so here we go. First of all, a normal cosine curve, remember that starts at its maximum, which in this case is going to be 1/2. So I'm going to put a dot there. It's going to finish at its maximum. So I'm going to put a dot at the end at 2 pi. And then in the middle, remember, it goes down to its minimum. And its minimum is going to be -1/2. Remember, between the maximum and the minimum, we're going to have a 0. And between this minimum and this maximum, we're also going to have a 0. So let's plot those points like that. Okay, and remember this has to flare, so let's just do the best that we can. And there you go. So there's your y equals 1/2 cosine x. And in this case, your amplitude is 1/2. All right, go to the one on the bottom left of the page. Now, again, please put these into your notes. Now, this one's a little bit different because we have a negative. So don't panic. Do you see that this is really a -1, right? All right. Even though there is a negative in front of that word sine, I'm going to see if I can squeeze that in there. We know, oops, I just ruined that, didn't I? That's really -1, right? And if I was using the amplitude formula, actually, you know what? I want to hold off. Let's draw this first. Okay, so let's go with the behavior of the curve. So it's a sine curve, right? So we start at 0, we end at 0, and we do 0 in the middle. Okay, Now here's where we're going to have a slight change. Normally between the first 0 and the second 0, we will go up to its maximum, right? That negative is going to actually tell you to flip it. So instead of going up to its maximum at pi over 2, we're going to go down to its minimum at pi over 2. And since this number is a 1, what we'll be doing is at pi over 2, we'll be going down to -1, so right here. And then you can imagine then that when we are between pi and 2 pi, at 3 pi over 2, normally we would go down to its minimum. We're going to flip it and go up to its maximum, which would be a +1. So all that negative does is it flips the graph, and it looks like that. Okay, so instead of going max then min, we go min then max. And there's your graph. All right, now I want to get back to this amplitude here. So the amplitude formula is max minus min, right? Divided by 2. Well, my maximum is still 1. My minimum is still -1. And I'm always dividing by 2. So that would be, what, 2 over 2? So my amplitude is still 1. So I want to be very clear on this then. This is why I was doing this formula. The amplitude is 1. Some kids get confused and they'll say, oh, it's the number in front of the word sine or cosine, so shouldn't it be -1? The negative is just going to tell you what direction you're going to go in, or whether you're going to flip it, really, if you want to think of it that way. The amplitude will always be the absolute value, if you will. It'll be the absolute value of this number. Okay, so your amplitude will always be a positive number. This negative, again, is just telling you what direction you're going in. So in the case of a sine curve, we start at 0, 0 here. Normally we will go up, but if that amplitude, if the number in front is negated, that means we're going to flip it and we'll go down first. Okay? Alrighty, so the last one, -2 cosine x. So just like the last one, let's just be a little careful that we have a negative here. So we can kind of cheat now, right? Just based upon the last one that we did, we should know that the amplitude is going to be 2. Remember, the amplitude is always the absolute value of that number that you're seeing in front of the word cosine. This negative is just telling you what direction we're going to be going in first. So we're going to be going down or starting down. Okay? All right. So a cosine normally, so speaking of, a cosine normally starts at its max and ends at its max, right? But because that's negative, we're actually going to start at its minimum, and we're going to start at -2. So I'm going to go down to -2, which means if I start at -2, that means I'm also going to end at -2. And then smack dab in the middle at pi, I'm going to go up to +2, so I'm going to flip it like that. Okay, now remember, between the first min and max, I should be hitting the x-axis. And likewise, between these two guys here, I should be hitting the x-axis. So let's put those dots there. There's one at pi over 2, the other one at 3 pi over 2. And now we can curve it. And there's your y equals -2 cosine x. Okay, so if you look at this graph here, it really is a cosine curve. It just flipped over the x-axis. So if you flipped it back, it would look like here. I'll just kind of trace it in the air. Go like this, and then go like that. Okay, so all that negative does is flip it upside down.